It's our third speaker of the morning session. It's my pleasure to introduce for that Professor Yann LeCun. Yann got an engineering degree in electrical engineering, his PhD in computer science from the Université Pierre et Marie Curie in Paris, and he did a postdoc with Jeff Hinton at the University of Toronto. He's currently director of Facebook AI research and the Silver Professor at NYU. His primary field, he lists as artificial intelligence and machine learning. And Yann is best known for his work in deep learning and really the invention of the convolutional neural network model, which is now widely used for image, video, speech, and text understanding. And I'm sure you'll hear much about that. So with that, please welcome Yann.
Thank you, Jim. Well, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I don't consider myself a neuroscientist. I don't actually consider myself a computer scientist either. I used to be an engineer. I'm not exactly sure what I am anyway. So I probably sort of, kind of fly in the middle of this diagram that Nico was showing earlier. So I have a question, which is both a practical aspect and also kind of an aspect in terms of how the brain works, which is, how is it that the brain learns so much so quickly? The models that we have, the AI models that we have, the machine learning models that we have, deep learning, etc., are not nearly as efficient as what we observe in biology in terms of how fast they can learn things, how few trials they need, and how much of a big understanding of the world they get by just observing the world or playing in it. We can't do this with machines today, which means that we're missing an essential piece, which evolution has figured out, but we haven't figured out yet. And this is why AI researchers need neuroscience and cognitive science, I think. I certainly have had over the years a lot of inspiration from neuroscience, as I'll tell you about a little bit, and I forgot to start my timer. Here we go. Okay, so there's a number of questions I'm interested in. In his talk, I had the advantage of being able to modify my slide as Josh was talking. It says all these AI systems that we see, none of them is real AI, and this is one of the increasingly large number of things that Josh and I agree on. There's plenty of things we disagree on, but we agree on this. In fact, we tend to start our talks the same way nowadays, as you'll see in a minute. The brain learns with an efficiency that none of our machine learning algorithms can match, and our supervised learning algorithms require a lot of examples, or reinforcement learning algorithms require ridiculously large amounts of examples or trials to learn anything, which is why they basically only work for games. They don't work in the real world, and that's why we don't have robots that are as agile as cats or rats or even simpler animals. That's why we don't have intelligent dialogue system and virtual assistants that are not frustrating and that have common sense. So what's missing? And I think what I'm going to argue is that we need new learning paradigms that basically build models of the world from observation and action, and not just through reinforcement, not just through supervised learning, but through another type of learning called it predictive learning, unsupervised learning. Unsupervised learning is a bit of a generic word. It's not a very different argument from kind of the main argument Josh had in his talk. So again, we agree on a number of things, and that's the most important one, I think. So supervised learning, we all know what it is. You have some sort of parameterized function, a classifier, a deep neural net, where you adjust the weights as learning takes place, and you show it thousands of examples of cars on airplanes, and whenever you show it a car, you tell it it's a car. If it doesn't answer a car, you measure some sort of error, and you kind of figure out how to adjust the knob so that the error decreases. And it's nice because there is nice theories about this. Those things can generalize to objects, to views they've never seen before, instances they've never seen before. There is transfer learning, so if you train one of those networks on lots of examples, you can add a new category with just very few samples, which starts to look a little more like human and animal learning. But we're still very far from that. And the way those sort of modern recognition systems and machine learning systems are built is based on the idea of deep learning, which is just the idea that computation should have multiple steps, basically, and representation of the world should be hierarchical in some way. That's all there is to deep learning, really. And then the question is, so you want to build a machine that is a cascade of parameterized nonlinear functions. They have to be nonlinear, otherwise there is no point having multiple layers. And then the next question you can ask yourself is what you put in the box. And that's where you can get inspiration from neuroscience. So the sort of modern way of building neural nets is you alternate two types of operations, sometimes 3 or 4, but in the simple case, just 2. You see the activations of one layer as a list of numbers. You multiply it by a matrix. Basically, you compute weighted sums. And then you pass the result to a pointwise nonlinearity, which in modern neural nets are just a half-wave rectifier. In old neural nets, it was a sigmoid, but we discovered that it's better to use just half-wave rectification. You can have neural nets with many more layers without running into problems when you do this. And training takes place by optimizing some sort of objective function that computes the discrepancy between what the machine produces and what you want. Using stochastic gradient descent, you estimate the gradient of this cost function with respect to the parameters, the connections between the virtual neurons, extremely simplified neurons, using the backpropagation algorithm. It's just a gradient estimation, efficient gradient estimation. And of course, you can get even more inspiration from biology, not just neurons and modifiable synapses and nonlinearity with a threshold, but also in the kind of architecture and the connection between the neurons. So convolutional nets are kind of very direct inspiration from classic work by Hubel and Wiesel, which were translated into computer models by Fukushima in the early 80s, and I got inspired by this to kind of build models of this type that are trained with backpropagation. And they're composed of essentially 3 types of operations: linear operations, which are kind of filter banked, like receptive fields in V1 or the visual cortex, plus a nonlinearity, and then the other operation is a pooling, which is very similar to complex cells, the Hubel and Wiesel's complex cells. And so this idea of stacking multiple layers, of course, a lot of people have had this idea before in some sort of conceptual model of how the visual perception or an auditory perception works. And as I said, the first computational models that kind of started doing something vaguely useful were Fukushima's neurocognitron. Started working on this in the late 80s and got some success with character recognition. This is the kind of stuff that those old neural nets could do. Recognize characters very accurately. Pretty quickly, we realized that they had one quality that more classical pattern recognition system at the time couldn't have, which was the ability to recognize multiple objects at the same time and to essentially partially solve the binding problem. So there is no explicit mechanism in those networks to bind features together to form objects. There's just many layers and nonlinearities between them, and that seems to be enough to solve the binding problem. There was a lot of work in theoretical neuroscience in the 90s about how does the brain solve binding problems by synchronization of spikes and fast changing synapses and things like this. And it turns out that doesn't seem to be really required. Doesn't mean it's not there, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, doesn't mean it's not useful in general, but for this, it doesn't seem to be required. So in the last few years, there's been sort of an explosion of work on convolutional nets because they, with the advent of fast computers and GPUs and large data sets, those things require a lot of data to be able to do a good job. The large data sets became only available in the last 5 years or so, and so that's when the field started taking off of using neural nets for sort of practical applications, even though there was success before. And so we have convolutional nets that have on the order of 1 to 10 billion connections. Oops, I went a little too fast here. I'm not sure what happened. A few million simplified neurons, anywhere from 8 to 20 layers. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And when you train them supervised, the kind of filters that are learned, the video unfortunately is not playing properly, the filters that you end up with are very much like V1 receptive fields, essentially, or at least qualitatively. Over the last few years, there's been an explosion, an inflation in the number of layers in those networks. And you don't want to think of the layers as physical layers, but more as steps of computation. So if you think of the visual cortex, the ventral pathway of the visual cortex, for example, as having recurrent connections within V1, within V2, within V4, each path around the recurrence you could think of as a layer. And so the networks that are used in practice, that are deployed by Facebook and Google and Microsoft, IBM, everybody else, have on the order of 50 to 100 layers now, or 50 to 100 kind of steps, if you want, in the computation. And all of them sort of convolutional in some way. And those are used on a big scale. There's a large amount of power spent running those things in data centers, Facebook and Google's data centers. Facebook users upload something like 1.5 billion photos on Facebook every day, and every single one of those photos goes through 4 of those guys within 2 seconds. So a lot of it is spent there. So the advantage of this idea of using multiple layers is just the idea that you want a representation of the world that is hierarchical, and the reason you want it to be hierarchical is because you want it to be compositional. The world is compositional. In fact, there is a nice quote from Jason Eisner, who's a natural language processing researcher at Johns Hopkins, who says, the world is compositional or there is a God. It's the only way we can think of the world as being understandable, right? Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it's comprehensible, and it's probably because there is some compositional structure to it. So objects are formed of parts, parts are formed of subparts, and subparts of motifs, and motifs of kind of elementary edges in the case of images, etc. And you have the same kind of hierarchy in language, in text, in audio signals, just about any natural signal. So you can train those things supervised to do all kinds of tasks, including driving little robots around. You train the robot by kind of this is a very old project, almost I guess 13 years ago now, and you drive this little robot in sort of busy environments. And the convolutional net just records the images on the camera and the steering angle, and then basically learns to avoid obstacles through imitation learning, essentially. You can be a little more sophisticated about this and drive robots. I'll show you a video at the end if I have time, which I probably won't. And a lot of ideas of using convolutional nets, not just to recognize objects, but to basically label the entire environment. So you can, this is more of the classical convolutional nets you can think of as being the ventral pathway. This is more the dorsal pathway. So instead of really sort of precisely classifying everything, you basically tell where everything is, and without necessarily having very accurate classification, but very good localization. And you can imagine that this kind of stuff is very useful if you want to drive cars around. So this is a little video from a company called Mobileye that was recently bought by Intel that builds a lot of the vision systems for certain self-driving cars. NVIDIA, the company that makes the GPU chips, is also working very actively on this and using those things on a grand scale for autonomous driving. There's been some interesting work at Facebook, which I guess in the context of computational neuroscience can be interpreted as sort of trying to merge ventral and dorsal pathway functionalities to enable a machine to not just recognize objects, but localize them, and not just localize people in general, but individual instances of each object. And it's kind of amazing that this works, but it works really very well. And it's conceptually very simple. It's a big convolutional net where the output is a bunch of masks for each object and categories, associated categories, and it's trained supervised or semi-supervised in some ways. And the results are nothing short of astonishing, where you can pretty much see that every object is outlined or colored in that case, and identified, including instances that overlap, like the sheeps in the top right. So this is something that where deep learning has brought about progress that people did not expect would happen so fast. So if you'd asked a computer vision researcher 5 years ago or 10 years ago, how long is it going to take for us to solve that problem? They might have said 20 years, or maybe not within my career or something. So it's kind of great that we've been able to do this, and that's what created the big interest from industry for those methods. And all of this is great, but you need to collect a lot of data and have it labeled by humans to be able to do all those things and figure out what pose people are taking and things like that. The supervised learning works when you have enough resources to collect data. In fact, convolutional nets are used at Facebook for translation. So some of the language pairs that Facebook automatically translates when a post is made in one language, and Facebook knows you don't understand that language, it translates automatically. And some of the translation systems use convolutional nets. They're applied to the kind of a text sequence. It's a sequence of words, essentially, where words are represented by vectors, and it goes to a convolutional net that kind of produces an abstract representation of the meaning of the sentence, and then another deconvolutional net, which is sort of a convolutional net backwards, if you want, that kind of generates the translation. So it's kind of a bit of a general tool. But there are lots of questions that are left in the air if we are interested in how the brain works, or really what intelligence is all about. So one question I've been asking myself, and getting different answers from different people is how many learning algorithms does the brain implement? And I put quotes around algorithm because we know it's not clear whether that is best described by the word algorithm. So is it close to one or maybe a few? One general algorithm for the cortex, if you want. Is there an algorithm of the cortex? And of course, there would be different ones for the hippocampus and the cerebellum and stuff like that. That's okay. There's still a small number. But there are people who say that no, it's just a kludge, right? Evolution just kind of cobbled this thing together so that it would work, and there is no hope of finding any general principle behind its function. Gary Marcus is one of those, a colleague at NYU in the psychology department, and he's made that point that, in fact, he has a book whose title is Kludge, that describes how the brain is a collection of hacks, essentially. So if he's right, then the whole enterprise of trying to figure out how the brain works from first principle is not going to succeed, essentially. But whether it's true or not, I'd like to use the hypothesis that it's true and push this as much as we can. How much prior structure, this is another question that also Gary Marcus is interested in, and I assume many people in the audience, how much prior structure does animal learning require, and human learning, and of course machine learning? So convolutional nets are an example of imposing some structure in a machine learning system so that it learns concepts that are relevant, and it represents them in sort of appropriate fashion. But how much such structure is required if you want to build sort of an end-to-end intelligent system? That question is completely in the air. Is there something really special about the visual cortex, for example, compared to the frontal cortex? What's different? Is it something that's really relevant or not? Or is the cortex just kind of a uniform piece of goo that learns whatever it's fed? It's the old nature-nurture debate. This is actually what got me to machine learning in the first place, kind of reading about this in like debates between psychologists and linguists, Chomsky and Piaget and people like this. So all of our learning algorithms are designed are sort of based on the idea of minimizing some sort of objective function. That's what makes them sort of well-principled. You will have a hard time getting a paper accepted in a machine learning conference unless your machine learning algorithm minimizes some sort of objective function. But if the brain minimizes an objective function, first of all, does it minimize an objective function, even if it's implicit, right? And if it does, what would that function be? It would probably be a collection of multiple functions, but what would it be? And then the next question is, how does it minimize it? So all the efficient algorithms we have evaluate gradients by backpropagation. You estimate the gradient using backpropagation. That's very efficient. When you have non-differentiable parts in your learning system, you kind of have to evaluate the gradient by perturbation. It sort of works, but it's really, really inefficient. And so I don't think it's kind of a very common principle for efficient learning. Gradients really work really well. And I don't know any alternative to this. So, does the brain do backprop? I'm not talking about supervised learning necessarily, but is there a way? Joshua maybe is going to talk about this later. Here's Joshua. Hi, Joshua. he's been working on explaining how, trying to find forms of gradient evaluation that could be biologically plausible. And then one important question that I'll come back to a little later is how does the brain handle uncertainty in prediction? So this is something where Josh immediately jumps to saying, probabilistic models. And I'm wary of probabilistic models because probability distributions in high-dimensional spaces are horrible objects that we can't represent. Pardon?
Another thing we agree on.
Another thing we agree on. Yeah, but I'm perfectly ready to throw probability theory under the bus. You're not. Our trajectories are converging. Yes. So, what's the obstacle to AI? What is it that we don't have machines that can learn to navigate the world as well as a cat? What is it that we don't have systems that can learn language as well and as efficiently and how the world works as kids? Or orangutans. We had example of orangutans. Amazing animals. They're not social. They don't have language. They're solitary animals. They're incredibly smart. Almost as smart as we are. Probably smarter in some ways. The punchline before I go into this is that our AI systems need to learn models of the world, and they need to be able to use them to reason and plan. And again, it's very similar to what Josh was saying. Common sense is kind of a recurring sort of holy grail kind of question in AI, like how can machines get common sense? There is something in AI called common sense reasoning, which doesn't mean there are methods to do this. It's a problem, it's not a solution. But common sense, perhaps, if you kind of reduce it to something concrete, is the ability to fill in the blanks. So for example, the ability to infer the state of the world from partial information. From, say, visual information. You don't see everything about the world, but you can infer a lot of information about the world through vision, even though you have only a partial description of it. Infer the future from the past and the present. Predicting the future is very important for intelligence. In fact, arguably, it's the essence of intelligence. Infer past events from the present state of the world, like what happened. Filling your visual field, there's low-level functions of this type, filling the retinal blind spot in your visual field. We're not conscious of it because our brain fills it up, at kind of a relatively low level, below, at subconscious level. And that is probably based on some sort of prediction. We can predict how the world is going to look if we move our head 20 centimeters to the left. And that's because we've kind of abstracted the notion of depth and, objects that are in front of others and things like this. And we probably learned this at a young age. So depth is kind of an emergent property of being able to predict what the world is going to look like when you move your head. So predicting any part of the past, present, or future percepts from whatever information is available, I think is the underlying ability from which common sense can emerge. But what we need here is a way to train machines to kind of do those predictions. And that's what generically a lot of machine learning people have called unsupervised learning, although that means a lot of other things. So I prefer another phrase for it, predictive learning, which doesn't mean necessarily predict in the future, but predict whatever is missing. And unsupervised learning, unfortunately, is kind of like the dark matter of AI in the sense that all of the stuff you see about AI is all supervised learning and reinforcement learning. But really, most of animal learning is unsupervised, and we don't know how to do this. So it's sort of like physicists who tell you, we know ordinary matter is like 5% of the mass of the universe, and the other stuff, the 95%, we have no idea what it is. Dark matter, dark energy, etc. We really have no idea. So the same kind of embarrassing situation. We learn how the world works by observation. We learn object permanence, like this baby here on the top right. We learn all kinds of basic things about the world very early on in the first few months. This orangutan here figured out that an object cannot disappear by magic. And so he's totally fooled by this little simple magic tour and kind of roll on the floor laughing when he realizes the object is not there. Right? So a break in your model of the world is either funny or scary or surprising. And in fact, that's exactly how psychophysicists or child development psychologists test whether something is kind of understood by a baby or kind of breaks the model of the world, right? You push this little track here off of a thing and it doesn't fall. And below the age of 6 to 8 months, babies just don't care. Say, sure, yeah, right, yeah, why not? And after 8 months, they say, wait, this can't be. This thing has to fall. And so they look at it like the baby on the bottom left here, and that's how you can measure whether the model is being violated. And so Emmanuel Dupoux in France, at École Normale Supérieure in France, has kind of made this chart of all kinds of different stages at which, number of months at which we learn those basic concepts, like recognizing biological motion from sort of basic objects. Object permanence we learn pretty quickly within 2 months, but it still takes 2 months. Rigidity, stability, and support. The towers of cubes that from my colleagues at Facebook that Josh were showing is kind of that kind of thing. And then gravity comes around 8 months, etc. Motor control comes later than perception. Babies learn perception much earlier than motor control. And so the idea that somehow you need to interact with the world to perceive it is not clear. It's not clear how much of it you need. But there is another argument for unsupervised learning, which is an argument Jeff Hinton has been making for 30 years, which I didn't quite believe at first because I didn't know how to define unsupervised learning. But his argument goes like this. He says, the brain has about 10 to the 14 synapses, and we only live for about 10 to the 9 seconds. So we have a lot more parameters than data. This motivates the idea that we must do a lot of unsupervised learning, since the perceptual input is the only place where we can get 10 to the 5th dimensions of constraints per second. In other words, it says, predict everything you observe, because that's the only way you can constrain a large brain enough to learn, all the parameters it has. If you only ask it to predict a couple labels or a value function, you're going to require millions and millions and millions of examples, and you're never going to be able to learn anything, essentially, in your lifetime. So that led me to this obnoxious analogy, obnoxious to certain people, which is if you want to quantify the amount of information that a machine is given, the amount of feedback a machine is given and asked to predict in different modes or paradigms of learning. In the case of reinforcement learning, so reinforcement learning is the scenario in machine learning where you don't tell the machine the correct answer, you just wait for it to produce an answer and you tell it whether it was good or bad, essentially, a single scalar at every trial. Supervised learning, you give the correct answer, and so if it's one among 1,000 categories, that's something like 10 bits. So you give quite a bit more information to it, so it's going to learn things with less effort. And unsupervised learning, you ask the machine to predict everything, basically. Tell me what your complete perception is going to be in the next second, minute, hour, days. And so the machine has to do a lot, and it only needs to wait for the future to occur to get the feedback. And you get a lot of information from that. That's the only way you can kind of get enough information to train a large system, and that's the only way a machine or an animal can learn a model of the world, predictive models of the world. So it's become sort of obvious to me that that is something that we need to be able to do with machines. That said, so basically, I was talking about the dark matter of AI being, being unsupervised learning. In this case, the dark matter is actually chocolate genoise, which is sort of yummy. That said, we do work on reinforcement learning at Facebook. Traditional reinforcement learning for, playing violent games or playing other violent games. This is very interesting kind of vehicles for developing sort of end-to-end AI systems that learn to act and perceive and everything. But here is where I really want to go. Rich Sutton, a number of years ago in 1991, proposed an architecture he called DINA, in which it has this argument. The main idea of Dyna is the old common sense idea that planning is trying things in your head using an internal model of the world. This suggests the existence of a more primitive process for trying things not in your head, but through direct interaction with the world. Reinforcement learning is the name that we use for this more primitive direct kind of trying. And Dyna is the extension of reinforcement learning to include a learned world model. Now, truthfully, all of this now is called reinforcement learning. It's just that what he called reinforcement learning with a model is called model-based reinforcement learning. But a lot of people call a lot of things reinforcement learning that may not necessarily deserve the name. And it's based on kind of, there's some parallels with the classical idea of optimal control. So in optimal control, when you want to, plan the trajectory of NASA plans the trajectory of a rocket, okay, using simulation. It has an accurate model of the rocket, numerical model of the rocket, and it has two functions for it. It knows how to compute the next state from the current state and the commands, and also it knows how to propagate gradient through it. It's basically using backprop. In control theory, they called it the adjoint system method, but it's really basically backprop in time. They invented it way before machine learning people. And so you have essentially a simulator that of the thing you want to control, which is a differentiable function for which you can compute the gradient, the derivative of the output with respect to the inputs. And this thing, you simulate it, step by step, discrete time. Every time you feed a command, position of the nozzles for a rocket or whatever it is. And there's an objective, which is, get to the space station by, minimizing fuel consumption and, not taking too long or something. And what you do is, by gradient descent through backprop through time, essentially, you figure out a sequence of commands that minimize the objective function. And you can propagate through all those modules, very easy. This is how also sort of classical robotics does planning, trajectory planning. So you have a model, a perfect dynamical model of the robot you want to control, and you have some specification of the constraints and the cost. You don't want to hit obstacles too close, things like this, minimize jerk, and do a particular task. And you do this planning that way, essentially. So that perhaps suggests an architecture for an intelligent system, which would be something like this. Intelligent system interacts with the world. It produces actions to the world that possibly affect the state of the world. And in return, it gets percepts, or observation, that go through a perception module, and we know how to build this, although we have to use supervised learning to train it. That representation of the perceptual world goes into an agent, and the agent is trying to optimize some sort of objective function that measures an overall cost. So this objective function measures unhappiness, essentially. And it takes the internal state of the agent as an input and tells the agent you're happy, you're not happy. Now, if we believe in this idea of sort of model-based, prediction, having a way of predicting what the world is going to do so that you can think ahead about what kind of action you want to take, inside of the agent, there has to be some sort of world simulator, a world model, that can predict where the world is going to do, either because the world is being the world or as a consequence of the actions of the agent. There's an actor, so this is the actor-critic kind of lingo here, that generates action proposals that are fed to the world simulator that generates predicted percepts or world state. And that goes into a critic, and the role of the critic is to predict the long-term expected value of the objective. So it's a predictor for the objective function. You don't want to be able to just optimize the objective function instantaneously. You want to predict the long-term consequences of your actions without actually necessarily taking them. So all of those modules are trainable. The world model has to be an emulator of the world. The actor, of course, has to learn to generate action proposals that will minimize the objective, and the critic has to learn to predict the long-term expected value of the objective. And again, this is kind of, I wouldn't say completely classical, but relatively classical models in reinforcement learning, and particularly in sort of, models of how the brain is organized and the reward mechanisms and all that stuff. So in a typical trial, you would observe the state of the world, run a sequence of actions produced by the actor, predict the effect using the world simulator, And perhaps you might do a little bit of optimization to figure out a sequence of actions that would lead to a particular result predicted by the critic. And then just train the actor to produce that sequence that actually optimizes the objective function. So the main problem in there is that we kind of know how to train the actor and the critic. We have no idea how to train the world simulator. That's kind of the main technical issue I think that we are facing in AI today. This is a very personal opinion. Not everybody agrees. Few people agree, actually. But the main problem is, how do we train forward models of the world? And so Josh showed this work by Adam Lehrer, Sam Gross, and Rob Fergus at Facebook on trying to kind of do intuitive physics, training a convolutional net to predict how cubes are going to fall. And when there is uncertainty, what you see is that those predictions where cubes are going to fall become fuzzy. So I don't know if I can point to any particular example here, but here you see it's hard to predict where this yellow block is going to fall, and so the prediction is fuzzy. And it's because the thing cannot, has to kind of predict an average of all the possible futures that can happen. We can actually train forward models to simulate various physical systems. I'm actually going to skip this because it's going to take a little too long. But you can use them to sort of optimize policies and sequences of actions. There's various work, which I'm going to skip also, in sort of predicting, using prediction to help train dialogue systems. So there's some work by Jason Weston and his coworkers that shows that if you train a dialogue system to predict what the next series of sentences that are going to be typed or spoken are going to be, then this dialogue system does a better job at actually adapting, if you train it with reinforcement learning, satisfying the answers of the user. There's quite a lot of work on this. Okay, so let me jump in the last 4 minutes on to adversarial training. So this is a new technique that was proposed by Ian Goodfellow, who was a student in Yoshua Benjo's lab. I'm sure Yoshua had something to do with it as well. And it's a very cool idea. And one problem that it might help us solve is the problem of predicting under uncertainty without necessarily appealing to probability theory or to kind of modeling distributions in general. So for example, let's say that we let a machine observe a few frames of a video, like me putting a pen on the table, and then I'm going to let the pen go, and the pen will fall. It's very hard to predict in which direction it's going to fall. And we're going to train a neural net here, G of X and Z. So X is the past, the observed frames, and Z is kind of a source of random vectors. And the machine is going to make a prediction. The prediction may be that, for example, the pen is going to fall to the left and to the back. But in fact, when we let the future play out, the pen falls to the back and slightly to the right. So technically, the machine is not wrong. It predicted kind of qualitatively the right thing, but it's technically wrong because the frame it's predicting is not the one that actually occurred. So what we'd like is to have a way to tell the machine, okay, your prediction was actually okay. It's part of a set of possible futures that are plausible, and I want to punish you for making the wrong prediction, picking the wrong one within that set. So what you want is an objective function that tells the machine any of those answers are correct or are okay, and it's only if you go outside of this set that things are bad. And the problem is that we have no idea how to characterize the set of correct plausible futures, so what we're going to have to do is train a second neural net to learn that function. And that's the idea of adversarial training. You have two neural nets, one that learns to predict, and one that is used to assess the prediction of the first one, and they're both trained at the same time. So in the sort of non-probabilistic version of it, basically your observed data is a bunch of points, and you want to give low energy to them, so you want the thing that assesses whether something is plausible to output a low number. And for everything else that is not plausible, you want this network to give a high number, and this is called energy-based learning in general. So this is how it works. You have a data set that actually produces the actual future, and a generator, a neural net that looks at the past and predicts the future. Currently is doing a really bad job. And those two predictions go to the discriminator, the second neural net that is supposed to assess whether a prediction is good or bad. The way you train the discriminator is that you tell it to produce a low output whenever you feed it real data, and you tell it to produce a large output whenever you feed it predictions from the generator. But now simultaneously, the generator is going to train itself to produce outputs that the discriminator can't tell are fake. Okay, so it's going to get the gradient of the output of the discriminator with respect to its inputs, and it will change its parameters in such a way as to produce outputs that the discriminator think are correct, are real. So, it learns this kind of contrast function that I kind of drew on the right here. The green points are produced by the generator, the blue points are the real ones, and eventually this function kind of shapes itself, and the green points kind of move towards the middle. And those things are amazing because you can train them to generate images. These are non-existing bedrooms where you put a bunch of random numbers in, you get bedrooms out. You can do funny arithmetics in feature space, which I don't have time to explain. You can generate funny-looking images that look like surreal art, like Salvador Dali dogs or something. You can do video prediction. So there are short segments where the first 4 frames are observed and the last 2 frames are predicted. And it kind of predicts more or less what's going to happen. It gets bad really quickly if you keep going. Same here. So here the system has been trained on video segments of New York apartments. And as the camera rotates, it has to predict what the apartment looks like in places it hasn't seen. So it continues the bookshelves and the couches and everything. And again, it goes bad really quickly. This is another example where here the prediction is not in pixel space, but in sort of the space of semantic segmentation. So we have categories for every region. And it predicts that if someone starts crossing the street, it's going to keep crossing the street. If a car starts to turn left, it's going to keep turning left. So let's see. I have one last slide. So in this AI agent architecture, the problem is how do we design the objective function? And we can't really design them because they are kind of complicated, so we're going to need to learn them. And this is kind of a big subject of discussion in the AI community, particularly on people who are worried about AI being dangerous. We're going to have to train our AI systems to behave, and that will have to be done by training their objective function, not just hardwiring them. So the 3 laws of robotics and et cetera, that's kind of the hardwiring, although it's kind of difficult to do. But the rest is we're going to have to teach them good from evil, essentially, the way we raise children. And it turns out that's very similar to how we train children. I want to end with this slide. I've been very inspired by neuroscience in my work, but very conceptual things from neuroscience. That's the real. How do you stop this?
Okay, so it's over then.
It's over. But there's a word of caution. If you try to stick to neuroscience too closely without really understanding the underlying principles, you might be hypnotized or blinded by the details without actually, finding the underlying principles. So one question I've been asking myself is there a general principle behind intelligence that could use by biology at one end, the animal world, but that we could use for machines that would play a similar role as aerodynamics plays for aeronautics and thermodynamics for, heat engines and things like that. And that's what I'm after. Thank you.